Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss a topic of energy saving, particularly in the manufacturing process. So there are of course many ways of saving energy in general in factories. However, today we'll be talking specifically about the manufacturing process, what are the sources of high energy consumption and how to solve them. Today with me I have Wojtek Bracha, who is product manager for the inverters for the EMEA region, and we are going to discuss in detail how this kind of energy saving can be achieved relatively easily and with limited effort to the production process as it is. So Wojtek, thanks for being here. I'm glad that we can talk. And I would say that for the last decade, the topic of energy was coming and going. So there were times when, of course, the energy saving was important. And then you could say that it disappeared for a while and so on and so on. However, it seems like today, the energy saving is becoming a top priority for manufacturing companies. And it doesn't look like this topic will go anywhere, right? So could you first outline like what's going on and what are the major trends shaping the current situation?
Hello, Piotr. And first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great chance for me to be a part of this very important discussion, especially from the manufacturing industry point of view. So answering your question, why this has been moved recently, why the topic of energy saving and energy efficiency in general has been moved from, let's say, secondary or the backstage right now to the front stage of today's manufacturing and the scene of challenges that industry is facing right now is, I would say, mostly affected by three factors. And among these three factors, we should specifically name legislation, economical factors, and also sustainability. I would like maybe not to right now assess which of them is the most important, but let's take quickly a closer look at all of these three areas. So when we speak about legislation, we are right now in a period that a lot of discussions are ongoing about the especially European Union legislations and frameworks which are heading towards having a sustainable society and sustainable manufacturing here locally in Europe. So here specifically we should name two frameworks, which is the Green Deal and also Fit for 55. Which is aiming to reduce our greenhouse gas emission by 55% until 2030. At the beginning, it might sound as very ambitious targets, but maybe later I will have a chance to explain, let's say, how doing some certain steps will bring us closer to achieving the final target, final aim. So legislation is the first factor. The second factor is the economic factor. And I know that from the point of view of many people, especially, let's say, from the finance and from C-level executives, this is one of the biggest challenges right now that the manufacturing industry is facing. Why is it like that? So energy in general is a kind of, let's say, undeniable part of the manufacturing, I mean, energy usage. So literally every product, every good that we as a society are using every day, it contains some energy inside. I mean that energy had to be used to produce, to manufacture some certain good that you are using every day. It required energy for transporting the good from the manufacturing finally to the place where you are using it. But also the goods that you are using every day, they are also using the energy. So the energy is undetachable from, let's say, our everyday life. And this is the reason why specifically manufacturing companies has to pay a lot of attention. Speaking maybe about some data. Doesn't matter which, let's say, report analysis about challenges of today's industrial manufacturing you read. Inflation and generally rising manufacturing cost is typically named as one of top 3 or top 5 challenges that manufacturing industry is facing. And the energy is obviously a part of this challenge. When we speak about numbers, it very much depends on the sector that the manufacturing company is operating in. But on average, we could say that 10% of the cost of manufacturing stands for the cost of the energy. And this ratio is rising. A few years ago, it used to be said that on average it was 5%. Right now, some estimations say that this is 10%, and in the future, this is not going to decrease, obviously. So here we have this economic factor. And the last factor, last power, which is influencing this topic, is also sustainability. Sustainability is also partially related to the legislation, but from let's say from the legislation point of view, this is a kind of headache maybe for C-level executives, and this is a kind of pain on the corporate level. However, from the point of view of small to medium enterprises, this is quite a challenging topic, because more and more often global industrial manufacturing companies, they are specifying from their sub-suppliers that to become a supplier of a certain global manufacturer, you must meet some certain sustainability targets. So for instance, you have to reduce your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions.
And I'd say that all of those topics are very much interconnected, and definitely they influence more than just Europe. So for instance, there are cases where for the manufacturing companies from Europe, that they are actually affecting how the production is being made in other regions, like for example Southeast Asia. Because of this discussion about the emission reduction in Europe, it actually creates this kind of imperative to change also the manufacturing processes at the supplier side, right? This is part of the whole, let's say, value chain discussion about the carbon emissions, right? So I think that Europe is this kind of a place where this kind of patterns are created, but they actually influence also other regions. And I think that very soon we'll have the same discussions in Southeast Asia or Middle East and so on. Let's say discussing specifically the manufacturing processes. So obviously, even by intuition, you could say that most likely the manufacturing process itself consumes a lot of energy. And it really doesn't matter that much what kind of process we are talking about, what kind of product we are producing, because obviously the production line has to move objects from one place to another, has to do the processing of those material and so on. So obviously manufacturing processes consume a lot of energy. But is there any, let's say, number that we can analyze and use for this discussion? Like, what are the typical, let's say, expected consumption rates in manufacturing?
Okay, so let's try to turn a little bit, let's say, facts and opinions into some real measurable data. So if we take a look global electric energy consumption, because I'm here specifically speaking about electric energy, is more or less on the level of 27 terawatt hours. So this is the global consumption by both residential buildings, commercial buildings, transport, and of course inside there is also industry. So this is a huge volume of energy that we are using, but also at the same time wasting in our everyday operation. When it comes to the industry, let's try to quantify a little bit what is the amount of energy at which we as a supplier who is delivering some technology has an impact, has an influence. So from this 27 terawatt hours that are used globally, according to International Energy Association, almost 50% is consumed by electric motors. I also checked the data which European Commission is reporting, and in European Union, more than 55% of the electric energy consumption is coming from electric motors, or we can call it electric drive systems. However, when it comes to the industry and industrial manufacturing, so the area in which we operate, this number is said to be two-thirds 2/3 of the electric energy is consumed by electric drive systems. So from this point of view, the potential savings that we can achieve by having some certain technology implemented is huge. Trying also to quantify, let's say, what can be the impact if we implement some certain technologies. Fraunhofer Institute recent research is showing that as much as 10% of the energy, of the electric energy which is used in the manufacturing, could be saved easily by just implementing variable frequency drives to electric drive system. And this is, let's say, this is a relatively easy step because the technology is already known, the technology is already, I would say, affordable, because the situation on the market is that right now this is, let's say, implementing the VFD is not a huge capital expense, and generally the technology is available. So this 10% savings we could achieve just by implementing that technology where it fits. Another 7-8% energy saving could be achieved by implementing high efficiency motors. So this is also the figure that is presented by European Commission, that by implementing high efficiency motors, and Eco-Design Directive is somehow supporting that, we can achieve by 2030 8% energy saving. So as accumulated value, it gives us almost 20% energy saving that we could achieve by implementing the technology which is already known, available, and in fact could be deployed just like that.
So of course, a first obvious step that you explained based on real numbers would be to modernize the production sites, making sure that the drive systems installed there are as efficient as possible, because at the end they will have to be used to produce, right? So this step of making the most efficient movement possible in terms of energy consumed is definitely very important, and I think we'll be talking about it much more. But of course, in the whole equation of energy transformation and the way how you approach the sustainability topics, of course, the green transformation is another one. And especially Europe is investing quite a lot in renewables. So how do you, in your opinion, how do the green transformation impacts the whole discussion on the energy saving in the manufacturing?
From my perspective, we are speaking a lot in media, in publicity, about utilization of renewable energy and so on. And as a rule, this technology is crucial to achieve sustainability. Maybe let's turn this a little bit into figures. So we mentioned before that one of the crucial legislation for European Union is the Fit for 55. So our aim, if we take a look, let's say from the helicopter view, so if our aim is to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 55%, that number sounds ambitious.
Yes.
But if we, let's say, break this down into different areas where we should search for the improvement, then can realize that this number is more realistic and achievable. As I mentioned before, according to estimations, for instance, of the Fraunhofer Institute, European Commission, and so on, in electric drive systems, until 2030, this is absolutely possible and achievable to have reduction on the level of almost 20%. So this means that by just implementing this energy efficiency, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 20%. And then on the top of that, we have still this ongoing green transformation in terms of the power generation. So utilization of green sustainable sources of energy. And you should also remember that these savings, they are accumulating. So if you reduce by 20% the emission by having efficient and well-working electric drive systems, on the top of that, if you add another 30% reduction coming from implementation of green energy sources, which finally at the end affect so-called CO2 emission factor. Then as accumulated value, we can easily, maybe not easily, but we should be able to reach this 55% reduction, or at least be close to that. And now, coming back to the question, let's say, which technology is more important? So actually, they are complementary to each other, and to reach our final goal, in fact, we must implement both of them. But from my perspective, I can say that energy efficiency is something what is more accessible at this moment, because in terms of, let's say, technologies that we can implement, we have less barriers. For instance, we have less barriers related to the infrastructure. We have less barriers related to the technology. Normally, usually, less time is necessary also to deploy these technologies, because if we speak about energy efficiency in electric drive system, these are rather, I would say, quick investments which we can do in relatively short time. Of course, they require some initial capital expenses that must be taken. However, it is widely said that energy efficiency is actually the most accessible and the cheapest source of power. So from the point of view of barriers that exist at this moment, and also from the point of view of capital expenses that we have to accept, this is most probably the most accessible way to achieve sustainability. Therefore, it could be taken as the first step. Maybe it's also worth mentioning that already many years ago, I met a concept of negawatt. So negawatt means negative watt. So this is the power which you can generate, like additional power, which you can generate, for example, for industrial manufacturing side by implementing energy efficiency. And in fact, it has also a kind of, let's say, hidden value, which is not directly coming from reduced operational expenses by lowering the energy consumption. Because if you think about a manufacturing site which is expected to grow their production in the future, in, let's say, normal condition, it is also necessary to grow your infrastructure, to equip your factory with new power transformer, additional bus bars, wiring, and so on. And at the same time, if you achieve energy efficiency and you reduce your current consumption by 10%, you still have a space from the power capacity point of view to grow your production without having a growth in the overall energy consumption.
Right. So I think that that you explained this very well. Well, there are different ways to achieve energy efficiency, and I think that companies can implement all of those different types. And maybe when it comes to, for example, production of the green energy in the factory itself, maybe we'll actually have another conversation about that, because I think there is a huge potential within such topic. But let's focus for now on the manufacturing, and let's speak about how the manufacturing companies need to approach this topic. Because, for example, I can imagine that a lot of what you just explained about how do you save the energy with the modernization of the equipment, or how do you use the renewable energy to achieve your goals, a lot of this is regulated. And right now we can say that European regulations are quite impactful on the companies, on the markets, and so on. There is some criticism of such, strong legislation or regulation initiatives, but at the end they are aiming at the goal we have in front of us, which is reaching sustainability, right? And you mentioned a couple of times some regulations, but maybe let's try to put them in some sort of order, and maybe let's try to make sense of all of the things that are going on in the industry. So what are the specific directives or regulations that the manufacturers should be the most aware of, and how they should react to them?
Okay, so before we mentioned about the Green Deal and Fit for 55, which is, you could say, influencing the current business landscape from the top. So this is, let's say, forcing to be implemented on the national, like country level and so on. But from the corporate point of view, we should be aware of the Energy Efficiency Directive, which is aiming, so again here will be a number, which is aiming to have reduction of 12% of the final energy usage from the reference year 2020 until 2030. And this is actually a regulation that is very much affecting industrial manufacturing, because one of critical points is that by October 2027, large energy consumers and majority of industrial manufacturing companies will be considered as one. They are supposed to implement ISO 50001, which is an energy management standard. This is, however, the legislation on the European Union level, so it can also have implementation on a local level with much bigger scope. So, for instance, as far as I know, in Germany, let's say, the minimum level of the energy consumption, which is used to classify as the entity as large energy consumer, is much lower than is set by the European Union. So, in fact, this will have implementation on a local level. So, my recommendation is that everybody should follow, let's say, local regulations that are being implemented right now in European Union members. So, this is from the corporate perspective. From the product perspective, one of the, I would say, most important regulations is the Eco-Design Directive, which is directly affecting products that are using energy in daily life. So mostly this will be products which are using electric energy. And this Eco-Design is a framework that is setting up mandatory requirements for the minimum efficiency of devices, of products that are using energy. And I have to say that this kind of regulation, this kind of framework, it has two very important roles. So on one hand, this is putting a pressure on manufacturers of devices to design the devices that we are using every day in, let's say, the most efficient way. I mean, to design the products that you are using every day so that they use less and less energy. And at the same time, it has a very important educational role, because when this kind of regulation is implemented on, let's say, country level, so it is somehow also forcing users of products to get educated, to understand, and possibly by this we can also promote and understand more what are the energy efficient technologies. So at the end, what we should also mention here is that electric motors and variable frequency drives are also affected by this Eco-Design Directive, which is somehow supporting achieving sustainability in the end.
And I think this is something we should discuss more in detail, because as you mentioned in the very beginning, is that this is where the potential savings lay, right? So the motor technology, how you operate those motors, how good the motors themselves are, but also how good the process is itself. So the Eco-Design Directive will be most likely an important regulation in that landscape. So what are the minimum requirements that are now mandatory for manufacturers to comply according to Eco-Design Directive?
So at first I have to say that Eco-Design is already making a change, not will make a change. And to understand the importance of this framework, let's take a look how was it implemented from the very beginning. So if we are speaking about minimum efficiency requirements for electric motors, actually it's all started before 2010, when for the first time electric motors were classified according to energy efficiency levels. So before 2010 we had a classification which was, I think, at the very beginning defining IE1, IE2 and IE3. Crucial change was in 2011 when, according to the Eco-Design Directive, IE2 was set as the minimum mandatory class for some certain power range of motors. Then it was gradually progressing. So over the time we had a change. For instance, between 2015 and 2017. So the first step of implementation was 2011, when IE2 was set as the minimum efficiency class allowed to be sold in European Union. Then in 2015 we had a second step when IE2 was supposed to be installed together with a VFD, or alternatively you could use IE3 motor. Then from 2017 IE3 was the minimum mandatory class to be used. And then the recent change that we had was in 2023, when motors from 75 to 200 kilowatt were set to be minimum IE4 efficiency. So using this occasion, we could also mention that Eco-Design Directive also touched VFDs, because from 2021 the minimum mandatory efficiency class for inverters or variable speed drives is IE2. However, from the efficiency point of view, it was not any milestone from our perspective as a manufacturer. Technologically, it did not mean any change to our devices, but maybe this is just Mitsubishi Electric, because I would say that energy saving is in our DNA. So implementation of this legislation did not require any technical changes. It was just the IE2 mark added on the nameplate of the device.
And yeah, when you're explaining how this was changing over time, this is clear that there is some imperative to improve and to provide higher and higher efficiency. But this is the regulation. But then obviously the technology has to follow. And I assume, okay, with the inverters, you said it was relatively easy to achieve. And I think that, generally speaking, inverter technology is already quite efficient itself, right? There is not that much you can do. However, when it comes to motors, obviously there are some technological advancements necessary to meet the new requirements. So thank you very much for being here. And I'm pretty sure we will meet again.
So I will be very happy to discuss all of these aspects next time with you in details. Thank you very much.